the BS Review. Today we are bringing you a all things spoiler review of Ready Player One. This is also going to include a book to movie adaptation discussion. So if you've read the book, we could talk about all the differences here. If you haven't read the book, we're still going to be discussing plot details of the movies and what we thought of that. So
if you haven't been keeping up with our channel, we have been doing a big Ready Player One series, and we read the book and we put up our spoiler-free review. We have a reading vlog where we week by week check in as we read through the book and our thoughts. And we already have our spoiler-free movie review up, so if you guys want to check those out, we'll card them up here throughout. We're talking about this over here, yeah. And so we're just going to jump into all things spoilers because there's so much in this movie and in this book to talk about.
If you haven't watched any of our other videos around this series, we were not huge fans of the movie for a lot of reasons, and we're going to talk about why.
Yeah, let's start off with talking about some of the major changes just in the storyline of Ready Player One and what they changed for the movie. The biggest thing was they changed essentially everything, but in the book, you have to find 3 keys and use them to open 3 gates. And you have to open the final gate and pass the test. So the keys are just part of it, and then they lead you to a test to take.
So you have to have a riddle to figure out the keys. So that was always a fun thing because it had to do with the pop culture references of Halliday. And then you would open the gates with those keys, and then you would have challenges within those gates. And this movie took away the gates, essentially. They're there, but they're not the same. So to get the key, you had to do a challenge. And then once you got the key, you opened the gate, which gave you a clue to where to find the next key.
Yeah.
But they weren't as intensive with the riddles and as think piecey, which I guess was okay because they had so much to go through with the movie. They kind of had to slow some things down. But I was really disappointed with a lot of the challenges they took away because they were very, very cool, and I wanted to see them on screen. And the ones they put in place were sometimes lame.
Which we will get into those. So they've already cut out essentially half of the test, half of the contest. So it already makes the contest seem a little easier, shorter, and not as big of a deal. And then they changed the specific tasks, and I think the biggest change was the very first one, which is this race. In the novel, if you haven't read it and you're on this video and you want to know what happens in the novel, the riddle they start out with is way tough. It's not just a race. They all have a riddle.
It takes people 5 years to figure it out, which it does in the movie too, but it's not as complicated in the movie.
Yeah, no one knows where even the key is located, even the first test to get the key is located.
In the book.
In the book, because of the riddle is so tough to solve. And that's kind of when we meet our main character and what makes him start to be a protagonist you want to follow, because he's not just some guy who shows up for the daily race that's always there. Is that he actually starts to figure out this clue, and he finds out that it's actually on the planet where he goes to school, called Ludus.
Yeah, because Halliday was a very big proponent of, I guess, kind of equal opportunity, essentially. He made the first challenge on the public school planet, which everyone has free access to, so it gave everybody a fighting chance. So I think having the first challenge on Ludus, which was the public school planet, was really important and really indicative of Halliday's character, that he wanted access to everyone. But that was not the case in the movie.
And they already changed a big thing because the contest to get the test to get the key in the novel is once you find it, you have to go through a whole Dungeons and Dragons cavern and fight the final boss. And you actually have to fight the final boss by playing a video game and beating him in said classic video game. And so already you're pulling all these cool references in, and these things like Dungeons and Dragons isn't even mentioned in the movie for how huge
it's not.
For how huge a part is
Well,
the
the only
novel.
time it is with it comes to Kira.
Well, that is true, but still.
So here's my biggest problem with the race in the movie, is the trick to the race was that you had to go backwards instead of forwards in order to complete the race. And it took 5 years and nobody figured it out. I'm sorry. Have you played video games? Have you been a part of video game culture at all? People would have figured that out within the first week, maybe couple of days. Especially with racing games, everyone knows that most racing games, or at least a lot of them, have little secret things like that. Maybe not full on backwards ones, but come on, somebody would have tried that. Are you kidding me? I just thought that was the stupidest thing.
One of the funniest things is that the first video game with an Easter egg, which is a big plot component of the movie at the end, they even mention the way that you find that Easter egg is by moving around the map until you find an invisible dot that you shouldn't know exists, and if you find it on the map, then you can carry all the way back to the one section and then go into a secret little area. Like who would have thought of that? But no one in his race thought to reverse, because that door opens as soon as he hits reverse. It like chunk, and like
somebody would have thought of that.
You think he would have had to do something more complicated. And yeah, nowadays any game that comes out, if there's like a secret or something like that, whole communities rise up and figure it out and do the craziest stuff. People would be jumping against all the walls until they figured out everything about this race, especially with $500 billion on the line.
Another big disappointment with the task changes was there were 2 tasks in the book where you had to essentially role play an entire movie, so it would plop you into the main character's perspective and you had to speak all of the lines and get the inflections correct and stuff like that for bonus points. And as a movie nerd, I'm sure many of you relate. I loved that part with all my being. I was like, I would get this so good. I would win these games. And they do war games, and they do Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I thought those were great throwback movies to choose for the novel. And the movie touches on this, but with The Shining.
But they also missed an opportunity. They could have done it just like in the novel with The Shining, at least if you want a better known movie. But I would argue that Monty Python and war games are up there with The Shining. But they didn't even do that.
No. And The Shining, it was not a playthrough. It was just, it wasn't even about The Shining. Like, that was just a weird way to get to the other part with the zombies. Like, that didn't make sense to me. It was weird.
Yeah, it really wasn't tied into The Shining at all for how to actually get the key at the end.
It felt like the only reason they put that in there was to have a fun, like, horror sequence, which I will say, it was a fun horror sequence.
It was.
But I also have some other complaints within that little sequence, but we'll get to that when we talk more about the characters.
Another major complaint for the movie, which banks so heavily on its nostalgia component, it actually doesn't have as many, like, pop culture references as honestly I was expecting going in. All the pop culture references were in scenes that were in the trailers.
Yeah, the thing is with the challenges and everything, the pop cultures are so ingrained in those and to what you had to figure out to get those. I felt like most of the pop culture references actually laid outside of those. Like, they were kind of there, but because they took so much away from the challenges, you didn't have as much time to spend on those. And I would say most of them were in the final battle, just on, like, people's characters and avatars.
Yeah, which is what I found is that the main way they showed off what was by other people just having them as their characters. But if in the novel, they reference bands like Rush, they reference classic TV shows from the 80s, they reference tons of video game culture, not just like
and not only video games, but other types of gaming too, like D&D. Before it became a board or video game, it used to just be pen and paper. And yeah, like Steven said, it relied very heavily on video game culture instead of 80s culture, which in the book, the 80s culture was very focused on movies, TV shows, and all of those other things. And it was kind of disappointing that this focused so heavily only on video games, or like 90% on video games.
Along with all those references, it almost felt like they ran out of time to fit those in because the novel takes place like 90% in the Oasis, and in the film, they actually spend a good half of the film out of the simulation, it seems like. There's a lot of real-world stuff happening on, and because they decided to add in this plot of having a resistance. And so when Wade gets in trouble, his house blows up, he actually gets picked up by the resistance where he meets Artemis, and they have this whole subplot about this, like, resistance going on to try and fight Sorento.
Whereas in the book, you didn't meet all the main characters didn't come together until the very end, right before, or no, not even right before, after the main battle, like in person outside the Oasis. I actually think that it was a good decision to introduce them earlier in the film. Honestly, the way they did it, I think could have been better.
I agree, and in the way they chose to introduce all these characters together was so different from even the novel, which they could have kept it the same, because in the novel, James Halliday's best friend and co-owner of the Oasis, ends up inviting them all over, flies them all in so they can be safe after Wade's house blows up, so the rest of them don't get blown up too, you know, especially after, which we'll get into later, a death of the high five, that he pulls the rest of them in so that way they can't be killed. And that's kind of when they all meet. You could have done that halfway through the film and had the rest of the film take place inside the Oasis like the novel does.
And with Simon Pegg playing Og, I honestly expected him to be on screen more. It was kind of disappointing that he really wasn't, and you find out that he was just kind of behind the scenes playing this curator, which kind of tied into the book because he was like in the background, like invisible in their chat rooms, like paying attention to things. But I didn't mind the curator spin on it, but I wish he would have had his hands in more on like helping them. And you also get a lot more history between him and Halliday in the book because of that, and it just felt like more personalized. Some other major changes that were made from the book had to do with the characters, particularly Wade's character. Wade in the book is kind of a douchebag gamer for a little bit. Like, not always, but he's kind of that trope. And the other characters in the book check him on that when he's getting a little too far-fetched, especially when it comes to his romance with Artemis. He gets a little too neurotic and possessive, which is super not cool. And, like, even H checks him on that. And this movie, I did appreciate that they didn't have him do that quite so much because it would have been hard to watch, and I didn't like that. But he did do some things, and the characters just kind of, like, let it go. Like, the whole insta-love thing that he had with Artemis was just a thing, and Artemis also was just like, sure, me too. And I was like,
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest problems is in the novel, when he starts to do that, Artemis from the beginning, it was very much like, no, like, this is not what we're doing. And then when he goes, I love you, she's very much like, well, we're done. I'm out. Because I already told you no about this, and you kept going. Whereas in this one, number one, the second time they, like, have an interaction, they go to the club, and he says, I love you, and she's like, and she's so calm about it, too.
She's super playful about it.
No, you don't. You don't love me. And then they meet in person, and she's like,
I guess.
That is not how any real female in any world reacts, much less a gaming. Like, it was problematic for this character, and it felt like it took focus away from the good parts of his character in the novel, that he's very intelligent, he's very strategic, like, and he doesn't really do that in this movie at all. He ends up actually just fumbling through, in classic 80s movie form. Things happen to Wade in this film, but he never really does anything.
That leads into another huge part of this movie that I had an issue with, and that is the lack of character development. The characters really don't change any from the point that they start at the beginning of the film and where they end up at the end. Like, their circumstances change, but them as characters do not change. And in the book, you definitely have that progression and the friendship progression and all those things, and it was disappointing not to have that on screen, and it made it fall a little flat.
One of my favorite parts of the novel that really showed Wade kind of going above and beyond, stepping outside of himself a little bit. It showed a lot of personal growth that he chose to do this, that he actually logged out of the Oasis, had himself get arrested for something else, infiltrated in person, and this is a guy who in the novel is an agoraphobe. He doesn't go outside, he doesn't see sunlight, he doesn't talk to people. He goes and becomes a prisoner in order to hack into IOI to lower the shield for the third gate, and it's just very cool to see him, I guess, ultimately be willing to sacrifice himself like that. He knew that he could get caught, and then it's over for him and for everyone else. And that was such a cool moment, and then they changed it in the film into a damsel in distress Artemis moment.
And it was an accidental thing. It wasn't a planned thing from the group. Having it be this accidental plan that just happened to them, like we mentioned earlier, this tends to be a theme, instead of this planned thing, and also it's not Wade that it happens to, it's Artemis, and like Steven said, she becomes this damsel in distress kind of situation, which redeems itself a little bit, but I just really didn't like that the choice was to throw the female into distress.
Out of all the characters you could have put into that situation, you chose to put Artemis, and I think that this movie just spends a good chunk of her character time focusing on her relationship with Wade, which I also wasn't a big fan of. We already talked about that insta-love and her response to that, but in the novel, she is Wade's equal, if not superior, in many aspects.
Especially when it comes to the Halliday knowledge.
Yes, and so she can not only hold her own, she's better than him in many ways in the Oasis, and she's more competent. Like, her character is higher level, like, she has better gear. Like, she is good at this, and he kind of, like, learns from her for a good chunk of time. And none of that's really portrayed in the movie.
It's briefly mentioned at the very beginning before they start the race because she pulls up next to him and he's like, oh, it's Artemis. I've read all her blogs and all of her playthroughs and all that stuff, or walkthroughs. And so they briefly mention it, but it's not shown on screen.
And speaking of characters not being portrayed as equals in this, H, a huge character from the book, one of the, I think, 3 main characters besides Wade and Artemis, in this movie is relegated to, like, goofy sidekick status.
And it particularly bothered me that they dumbed H down to the point where he was not aware of a lot of things that had to do with Halliday, because, like, the whole Shining sequence, he was like, oh, I haven't seen The Shining, like, I've always been scared of it. H in the book would have never been that way. Like, him and him and Wade constantly, like, did things together, learned things together, and while there are gaps in some Gunter's knowledge, it was his knowledge, H's knowledge was never displayed accurately in the movie at all. He just seemed kind of like a dumb character who was just a sidekick who knew how to rebuild things, but not a lot about Halliday.
Yeah, and unfortunately, H's character gets relegated to, like, the muscle, or to the goofy sidekick, which upon the reveal that H is actually a black female character, a black female gay character that is not mentioned in the movie, that
completely
she's gay.
Erased the sexuality of it.
But we talked in our spoiler-free review about how this movie embraces some tropes that are better left in the past. And
especially
one of those,
racial tropes.
Yeah, and one of those especially tends to be that black female characters, this has been recent too, tend to be comic relief in movies because they're the one who, when something great, things are blowing up, oh my god, they start yelling and they're the goofy, like in the Shining scene, the runaway, oh my gosh, what's happening? I'm so scared. Like, and that is H's character, and
which is nothing like the book.
And it just feels like, wow, that's kind of a trope, and out of all the characters, why did it have to be the black female character that this happens so consistently in Hollywood that it can be called a trope?
Well, and it was definitely a movie choice. That's not something that was in the book and then brought to the screen. It was something that was created for the screen. And along those lines, let's move into the other 2 characters of our high five group, and that is Dieto and Shoto, or Dieto and Sho in the movie. Let's talk about that. So, the importance of the names in the book are Dieto and Shoto, which roughly translates to, like, the bigger sword and the smaller sword in Japanese culture, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, that they played brothers, or they presented themselves as brothers in the book, which they weren't really, but I guess in the movie they were. They never really clarified that. They made Shoto younger, and they changed his name to Sho, which totally took away the significance of the bigger sword and the smaller sword, which makes no sense to me. And they also don't kill Dieto in the movie, which I think took away some of the higher stakes of this film, which is another complaint we have. And it just kind of made their characters dumb down, as they do with other ones.
And alongside the racial tropes, the only character in the real world who ends up knowing martial arts is actually Dieto. When they open the back of the van, that he just jumps into a martial arts fight, and it's like really like the only Asian character old enough to have a fight scene in the movie also just magically knows martial arts. And they never really reference that or why he does, or there's no context on the fact that he's Asian, so it makes sense that he knows how to fight. Another smaller detail that bummed us out that wasn't in the film is they spent a lot of time talking about the equipment that you get to use the Oasis, and how Wade starts with nothing but a visor and gloves, and he ends up upgrading to all this cool stuff. And they kind of skip over all of that, and he ends up having a bodysuit that can feel things from the beginning, and they take out all the cool equipment.
I mean, they kind of have the upgrades because he does get a cooler suit and stuff in the movie as they go, but that's like the extent of it, whereas in the book he has an apartment with security system and a full-on rig instead of just a suit, and the technology side of it was very cool to see some of that technology outside of the Oasis setting, whereas we didn't really get that in the movie.
Another issue we had with the film is that the villain, Sorento, is pretty goofy in this movie. In classic, like, 80s movie form, he's almost like an idiot. He's simultaneously evil, but stupid.
Which is not the case in the book. He's quite formidable in the book.
Yeah, he's smart, scary, he's willing to kill for what he wants, and in this one, and in the movie, he can't even remember his password for the Oasis,
And it's, Bossman69.
Yeah, there's so many other ways they could have presented him, and they chose to go with, idiot that just happens to be in a position of power and is evil, that honestly, it made him not seem scary in the film, and it removed some of the stakes for me. It was like, well, we know that there's no way he can prevail because the dude's an idiot compared to all these kids, which isn't the case in the novel.
Which leads into something we wanted to discuss, which was the tone differences between the book and the movie. I think that when you're adapting a book, especially one that is as popular as this, it's important to maintain the tone. And I was very surprised by the direction they took with this film. We both went into it expecting more of a modern film with 80s references. And in my opinion, it presented itself as an 80s film with modern references. And that just completely threw both of us off.
Yeah, I didn't really accept that it was an 80s movie until I think the end, and I was just like unhappy with it. And it made me feel a little better once I accepted that, but I felt like it took away from the content with how silly they decided to portray everything.
And because of the tone difference, doesn't necessarily make it a bad movie. A lot of people really liked the tone. It just wasn't what we wanted or expected. It was, like Steven said, just goofy. It doesn't make it an unenjoyable film. I think this film is enjoyable to watch. I'm not going to say that it's unwatchable. However, that made it kind of weird for us. Like we mentioned in our spoiler-free review, if you did watch that, we didn't hate everything about this movie. The visuals are stunning and really well done and pretty seamless between the virtual reality and real world. However, overall, this movie was just disappointing to us, but I know that's kind of an unpopular opinion that's going around, at least what we have seen so far from film fans. So, I don't know. I guess we're just going to have an unpopular opinion on this one, guys. That's okay.
But obviously we do care what you guys have to think too, so let us know down in the comment section below if you enjoyed this movie, or if you didn't like it like us, or if maybe you liked the book but didn't like the movie, or you liked the movie but didn't like the book. Let us know. We're very interested. We like to talk to you guys about these things, even if our opinions tend to be the unpopular one. And leave us a like if you enjoyed this video. We really enjoyed doing this series and making this content for this movie, even if it didn't turn out quite like we hoped. And hit that subscribe button if you like our content. We have tons of videos like this, other book-to-movie series. We have an It series that we did last year, and tons of other content. If you want to see some of that stuff, you guys can click right over there, and we'll see you next time.